Hi, I want to show you a few coloring techniques with ProCreate. I have a couple little tips that I like to use when I do my painting and coloring, and so I'm going to share them with you. So let me share my iPad so you can see Mr. DJ Zilla, a little character I drew the other day, and I'd like to walk you through the steps for doing some basic coloring and shading. I tend to follow a very similar process whether I'm working in Photoshop, ProCreate, even Illustrator to a certain degree, which is basically I start with a flat color. Then, after adding the flat color, I add shading and highlights. Of course, depending on the program, the shading and the highlights are done in a different way. So I'll kind of show what that's like. So let's say I want to do some coloring on Godzilla. First and foremost, I need to check my layers and make sure that my drawing layer is all by itself. I like having that drawing separated from everything so that I can always go back to it if I need to. If I'm doing more of an oil painting style, I might blend the coloring with the pencil marks. But for this cartoon style, I don't do that. Also, um, underneath my drawing layer, I need to create a new blank layer, which I'm going to use for the flat color. And you can make as many layers as you want, separating the different colors. But for this situation, I'm going to do just one color to get started. The other thing I need to remember to do is on the drawing layer, I need to click on the little N, and I need to change the blending mode from normal to multiply. I like using a multiply layer style or layer effect. These come from Photoshop. They're very similar to the way they work in Photoshop. But what that does is it blends the drawing layer into the color layer, but it doesn't merge the two layers. So it keeps them separate. So now what I need to do is click the dial up on the top, the little circle, and pick a good Godzilla color. Now, I kind of like this color. Maybe that's a good starting point, but if I need to adjust it slightly, like maybe it needs to be just a little bit greener, a little bit grayer, somewhere in there. That works for me. Also, to brush, I use a pencil mark when I do my drawings, but for painting, I'm going to do kind of a outline, and so I need a brush that doesn't have a fuzzy edge. So I can find that in the inking brushes. It doesn't really matter which inking brush you use. Tend to pick one that again has a solid edge and is fairly loose because my whole goal is to just outline Godzilla here. Now I can just draw and make sure that I connect all the lines. I'm going to do this kind of quick. I'm not going to worry about being super perfect. I know other people will sometimes do this. They'll draw this with maybe their selection tool or their marquee tool. Hey, that's fine. Whatever floats your boat. Me, I'm just trying to get all the way around his body, outlining the main shapes. And notice I'm skipping his claws. I think I would go back in and fix his claws later. Notice I made a little mistake, so I got the eraser and went in and kind of filled it in. I love the way you can just use both fingers, twist and turn your page, your workspace. Very intuitive. Some people wear gloves and do a Michael Jackson style when they draw their iPad. I don't. I just have gotten used to kind of holding my hand and tilting my pencil as I go. It doesn't seem to pick up too many stray marks. There are a lot of little, what do you call those, spikes on this back? I'm not going to color those in right now either. I can go back in and fill those in later. So now what I've done is I've made a continuous outline all the way around following the contour of Godzilla. And this is the easy part right here. If you click, press, and hold on the circle up in the corner and just drag and drop into your space, voila, it fills in right where you were, filling in the Godzilla. So I think when I selected the second color, it changed my outline color a little bit. So I am just going to quickly go over those edges one more time. what's visible to make sure that green is the same. Excellent. So once you have your base flat color in place, now we can start doing some of the effects to do our coloring. And like I said, I follow this process in Photoshop as well. I use a couple different layer effects to do it, but it's a very similar idea. The first idea is, okay, how do I add a color that can be my shadow color? And then how can I add my highlight color? So to do a shadow, what I do on ProCreate is I click my layers and I click my little plus symbol and I make a new layer above the coloring layer. And this I'm going to call shadows. And I have to do a couple specific things that make the painting really easy. First, I hit the N and I change that setting to multiply again. And I'm using multiply for shadows because the color I'm going to use to paint my shadow needs to blend with the green color of his body so they join together and it feels like a nice natural shadow. If I don't use multiply between the two layers, I can get more of a solid line or an edge, and it looks a little more graphic, I guess, stylized. That's a technique you may like, but for me, I like it blended a little more, so I like using that. The next setting I need to do is a little subtle, but if you tap on your layer, you get an additional menu of items. And what I want is I want layer number 8 to confine itself to the shape of layer number 7. And that's called using a clipping mask. So I press clipping mask, and now do you see on my layer, I have a little down arrow. So now that little layer points down to layer number 7. That means anything I paint will now fit within the boundary and shape of the green layer. I don't have to worry about coloring outside the lines anymore. There's another reason why having those flat colors in place makes it really easy to paint. So now, even if I use the exact same green color I have in my brush tip, it will look like a shadow because of the multiply layer. Now I just want to switch to one of my painting brushes, and I like using, I don't know, Nico or acrylic because I want to have a painterly look. So I'm going to click Nico, let's say, and I'm going to just paint right over his belly. Looks like my brush is a little bit small for this size of art, so I need to drag the top slider up a little bit, make the slider bigger. And I'm just painting a little bit of the underside of his leg and his hands. Now that doesn't look very good, does it? It's just blocky. Haha, watch this. What I like to do is to take my smudge brush. So I click on the smudge brush and I go back to painting and I like clicking either wet acrylic or acrylic. Let's try wet acrylic. And then I just smear and smudge that painted line I just made. It's almost like I'm reverse watercolor in a way. So it gives me a chance to kind of smear it around. If that's a little too smooth, try a different brush effect. Sometimes I go back to Nico and I smooth it and smear it around. It just depends what kind of effect I want. I tend to favor a more deliberate brush stroke. I kind of like, I got used to growing up with markers and stuff. I like the way markers look and I like the way brushes look. So I tend to favor visible brush marks. Other people, they might like more of an airbrushed or smooth approach. I tend to not like that as much. So I'm very loose with my smudging. You can kind of see how it slowly develops as I brush over the top. And if I don't like it or I want to remove some of it, I can always go back in with the eraser and I'll pick that same brush, that Nico brush. Just want to check my opacity so it's not too high. And then I might go in and erase a few lines, kind of erase back in some detail marks where I want them on his body. Maybe a couple on his center trunk here. I'm getting the feeling as I paint Godzilla here that I want visible brush marks too because I want him to have kind of a scaly, rough appearance, right? So by separating your painting technique between a flat color, a shadow color, and then here at the end, we're going to do a little highlight color. It helps you separate your steps in a way that doesn't get too confused. I mean, sometimes if you try to do color, shading, highlight all at the same time, your painting can get a little muddled and lost. All right, now let's talk about doing a highlight. Okay, I'm going to go back to my layers and I'm going to add, click plus. I'm going to add a new layer on top. I'm going to also tap it and click clipping mask. So now the brush strokes that I create are going to confine themselves to that layer space. And you can see how my layers kind of build up as I color. And I do this technique for every piece. So now I might go back in after the body is done and do a color for the headphones, his claws, and whatever else I feel like adding to him. I'll separate those so I can kind of keep them stacked. Other people, they're like, that's way too OCD, man. I just paint into it and do whatever. Knock yourself out. Don't have to do it my way unless you want to do it right. Hmm? Whatever. Now I'm going to look for a highlight color. So I'm going to go back to that original green, tap it, and I'm going to look for like a highlight green, kind of a grayer, lighter tone. Notice I didn't change the layer effect on this because I don't need to. I'm painting with a lighter color, so that lighter color can lay right on top of the others. I'll go back to get Nico, and I'm just using this kind of light logic. If the underside of his body and maybe let's say the left bottom side of his body is shadow, well then that means the highlight will be on the opposite, so top right. So over his head, you get a little bit of a highlight. That's a funny little stripe down his back, his tail, tops of his hand. That was a little too big of a stroke, so I'll make it a little smaller. Part of his snout, right? I'm thinking about those areas that would be facing the light, so they'd have a little more brightness. And I'll go back in with my smudger and kind of smudge it around. Blend it a little bit better with the background piece, what you see, right? I can also switch brushes. That Nico's kind of a thick brush, creates a nice thick square brush mark. Maybe I'll go back to my sketching pencil and kind of pencil in some detail. Maybe highlight his scales a little bit. All right. I can paint in his teeth if I want to. I want to use this color. I'm just adding a little bit of detail. Right. So I did 3 different levels. Flat color, made it darker, then made it lighter. Now my ultimate highlight is going to be probably reserved for almost white. And in this case, I'll start with white, but ultimately when I finish the painting, it might be shifted to a certain color range, like light blue or something. Let's say if I wanted to create a glow, and I'm imagining in my mind that maybe the spikes on his back and stuff might create a little bit of a glow. So I might use a brighter blue. So let's kind of go that direction, kind of a light bluish white. And then I'll create another layer. And this one I will reserve for highlights. Oops. So highlights might be just certain spots. You don't want to use your highlights everywhere. Highlights are meant to be, bright highlights are meant to be used kind of sparingly. So they're used too much, then they kind of get too bright and get in the way. So that's my basic technique that I use to kind of finish off Godzilla. I'm not going to go in and paint his spikes and his headphones right now. That might take a little too long. So I'm going to skip to what I might do for the background. If I want to give him kind of a background, I'll go back and create a layer at the bottom of the pile below everything else. And one of the things I love to do is use a soft brush called Salamanca. Don't remember where I got it. I hope it's one of those ones preloaded in ProCreate. I'll show you in a second. But what I need now is a background color. So Godzilla's kind of a greenish color. You can't go wrong when you pick kind of a complementary color. So if I have the green color of Godzilla selected, right? I go back to my color dial and I select Harmony. I'm going to click on the top where it says analogous, and I'm going to click on complementary to see what it picks. See how it picked this purplish reddish color? That's now going to be my background color because I like using complementary colors a lot. Sometimes I'll use split complementary, but you kind of have to make those manually. So I'm going to stick with that reddish color and I'm going to look in my painting for Salamanca. And this one's cool. It's like a wet sponge. I love how it just kind of paints over the whole surface. It looks really awesome. And I like that. I like that roughness. I like just that smear and the way it kind of smears around. It creates a cool effect on the background where I might even come in with my eraser, my smudge brush, and even do a little bit more just to kind of make the edges even more rough and disrupted, right? I just like that a lot. You may not like that. You may want something else. That's cool. You do what you like. You be you. Then as a final step, what I'll do is I'll go back and create another layer up at the very, very top. And this is where I do kind of my final highlights and outlines. This is where I do little detail marks that I just like to do for my particular style. And I'm also going to pick a really bright color. I might go back to that same bluish white color and I'll come in with my pencil. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is now just kind of outline the outside of my character. I like giving that little detail line right along the edges. Creates a nice little outline and separation for Godzilla from the background. Now, as you can see, I did not finish his claws. I'll go back in and finish that later. But I just wanted to give you kind of my finish technique and show you how I go in and add those marks for the outline style. Right? Okay. One other thing I thought of is I wanted to give his nostrils like a little smoke effect, like he just let off one of his Godzilla um, flames out of his mouth, you know? So just to experiment with that, I might even make another layer and I'll pick kind of a creamy color and I'm going to try. I'm not sure which brush is going to do this effect the way I want it. So I might try to sketch it in first and then kind of blur it. I see that smoke kind of billowing. Now there are other cool brushes in here like um, organic effects and lighting effects and elements. I was thinking of maybe smoke. See what smoke does. Yeah, I think that's kind of cool. Might make it much smaller to do a little bit on this side. There he is. DJ Zilla, chilling, plugged into the radio tower. All right, so I'm going to spend some more time finishing this. I just wanted to run through my technique so you could see how the painting gets built up. I know it's unfinished, but I'll finish it later and post it. But I wanted to give you an idea of um, how those work, how those brushes work, how you might separate your layers and use those layer effects in ProCreate to separate your painting and break it down into steps. It's really hard to kind of do that painting all at once. I've always struggled with that kind of a method where you just mix your color and your shadow and your highlights all at once. And that always made it very confusing for me. So for me, separating into layers, doing one color at a time, then adding highlight and shadow, that seems to be my preferred way to work. See what you think. All right. Talk to you later.